Okay, so overlapping generation model in 3 hours or less. So what's the point of using a model like overlapping generation? The point of using a model like overlapping generation is that the infinite lived agent model is a very particular structure that is useful for certain analysis, but it's not useful to understand a lot of phenomena out there, among other things because people don't live forever and are also linked demographically from one generation to another, and this has economic relevance. The fact that people has blonde or brown hair, dark eyes or blue eyes, maybe not. So we don't need to model that. The fact that people don't live forever has relevance. So what's the point of the overlapping generation model? From the very abstract point of view, it's a way of throwing away the intertemporal auctioneer. If you think of the way the infinite horizon, language, infinite horizon, when it applies to the economic system, applies to both models. In both models, the economic system lasts for an infinite number of periods or an indefinite number of periods, okay? So it's finite life of the agent, infinite life of the agent, okay? In the model in which agents have an infinite life, you can typically trade today for any point in the future. And what's important, you trade with every possible participant. Every agent that will ever be in that economy and will therefore have some role or action, utility, blah, 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 is present at all times, okay? In other words, it's a setting in which the notion of Pareto optimality can be applied. The notion of Pareto optimality, we have already mentioned that it's plays a very strange role in economics. It's a very simple, intuitive rule, but my belief is that we have overused it and abused it. It's clearly not conceived for addressing a lot of efficiency or welfare issues. One of them is very clear with overlapping generation, which is, in overlapping generation model, it's completely unclear who's the set of agents for which the economy should be Pareto efficient. Now, economists have tried. There is a notion, and I will not debate it with you, but if you're interested, go read it, of interim Pareto efficiency or overall Pareto efficiency. But as many people have pointed out, and Larry Jones, Golosov, and other more recently with a bunch of papers that we've been discussing together, the real issue is when you cannot trade with people that are not yet born, and the number of people that will be born is yet to be determined, how do you define Pareto efficiency? How do you define Pareto efficiency when demographic choices are endogenous? Okay? And the overlapping generation model makes that completely clear. In any case, and even leaving the demographic choice outside, in the overlapping generation model, you cannot trade with people that are not yet born. And this is of first order relevance, as any debate about pension, inheritance, environment, capital accumulation, intertemporal public goods, make it very clear. So the overlapping generation model is quite useful to think about this problem, to think about the kind of institution or intergenerational arrangement you want to set up to solve, or at least to address, maybe not to solve, but to address the inefficiency issues that come around from the fact that right now you're issuing debt, that debt belongs to an abstract entity called the state, and it's actually a claim on income and taxes that will be produced by people that are not even born, so cannot participate either in the political or in the economic environment and decision making. Okay, so public debt is probably the best example of this. The original suggestion for the model was, the known one is Paul Samuelson, I believe 1958 article. There is actually a discussion of a structure completely analogous to overlapping generation in a book by Maurice Allais, French economist, that was not circulated and was not taught around the world, so that there was a certain point an argument and the usual nationalistic thing, or the French or the American, because the Allais thing was not known outside French-speaking people. And so when it came out, Samuelson had not cited Allais. I don't believe Samuelson knew Allais. And he knew the work of Allais when he wrote the model. But it doesn't matter. Who cares? The structure of the model is relatively simple, and it works like this. So in the very basic one, actually, you can use overlapping generation model, and they're most useful for application when people live more than 2 periods. But in general, you want your agent to live T periods and make those T periods a realistic number. And for practical application, it's particularly useful to study labor supply over the life cycle, marriage issues, pension, obviously, and saving behavior, and so on. So in those contexts, you make people live 100 years, and each period lasts 5 years, so they live 20 periods. And you use one thing that allows you to make something that you cannot do in the infinite horizon model. You can make use of mortality table in a relatively efficient way. Remember that we often say in the overlapping in the infinite lived agent model that the discount factor should be considered as a product of at least 2 things: your pure intertemporal rate of time preferences and the probability of survival. But obviously you cannot apply it literally, because you have no observation of probability of survival past 120 years or so. So you cannot construct something that goes to 0 only asymptotically using that, right? In the OLG model, you can do that, and you can do it in a reasonable way. So you can think at generation having their probability of survival from one period of life to the other, okay? In the introduction, one uses a simple model of 2 or 3 periods. So what I'm going to do is use a few examples of the 2 periods in the first half, and then use the 3 periods to discuss things I care about in the second half, okay? All right, so the simple model with 2 periods, you live 2 periods, one you're young and the other you're old. You're born in the first period, and you have utility over both consumption. So you're born in period T, and you're young, and you care about your consumption. And then you live also next period, and you care about your consumption when you're old in period T plus 1. In general, when there is the structure young, old, or young, middle-aged, old is not there, but you live many periods, people tend to put here the calendar time, and here the date at which you're born, you're born, the date of birth, okay? So CTT would be people in period T, born at T. And here it would be T plus 1 T, because these people are born at T, but are consuming at T plus 1, and so on. Yeah, one problem with OLG with many agents and many periods is that the notation becomes terrible, because if on top of that you also put some heterogeneity within a cohort, say 2-3 types, very smart, so stupid, and then you start having 3 indices, and you get, but anyhow, so that's the utility function. In the classical setting, in which you want to show the gains from intertemporal trade, what is that you do? You say this agent has an endowment when old, okay? And out of the endowment when old, they have to find a way of consuming in both periods. So one way of thinking of this is this, right? there is when I'm young, here when I'm old, here I have my endowment, and here I have my indifference curves. Okay? The trivial point, here it's extreme, but you can make it like that, right? You put it in down here. The trivial point is that if I stay at autarky, okay, I'm always achieving a level of utility that is lower than the level of utility I could achieve, right, if I consume intertemporally. So the argument is, well, you know, if there was some market, some way of trading intertemporally, all the stuff I have here for some stuff there, I could reach a higher utility function, higher isopod. I just draw a line, and we can see, you know, I can go here, even without optimality, or here, if it chooses the optimal point, that's a lot more utility than one I achieve. Okay? Now, is that a deep point? Depends, right? Not very deep, but it's a starting point. It suggests there are gains from intertemporal trade. And there are gains from intertemporal trade across generation. Okay? The point that Samuelson made and others made after him is the following. In a setting like this, if the gains from trade come from the fact that right now the old people would like to consume more and would have liked to give up some part of the consumption when young in order to consume more now, they are faced with an impossibility. Because the people that are alive and they can provide them with something are people that, one, were not born when then the old people had something to give. And two, those people, the young people now, will be willing to receive something, or will be waiting to receive something in exchange next period or 2 periods from now when the old guys are dead. Alright? Now obviously notice that this is very extreme. Right? Because as you increase the number of generations, the problem becomes weaker and weaker, right? You see? Think about it. In the setting the Samuelson uses, right? This is generation T and this is generation T plus 1. Right? They're born at T and they're young at T. And here they are old at T. And these guys are young at T and old, and they're old at T plus 1, I'm sorry. And they're old at T plus 2. Right? And what is the problem? The problem is that trading among these two does not make any sense. Because this guy does not have a tomorrow and he wants money to go toward him. This guy, same person, wanted to give money, but there was nobody. Right? Well, now start thinking. Right? Well, things are getting a little better, right? Because here we can trade, or even vice versa, in fact. We can trade, right? And if I now start adding more periods, the number of periods that we can trade increase, right? Sorry. Right? Now these guys can trade all these periods, and these guys can trade all these periods. Right? In other words, we observe a lot of intertemporal trade among people of different age every day. The real extreme emerges only when? At the very last period of my life and at the very first period. Okay? So one has to be very careful. Samuelson was remarkably brilliant, but one has to be very careful because the kind of brilliance that Samuelson had sometimes is misleading. The guy had the ability of constructing very sharp examples to deliver a concept, but one has to be careful about using that concept. Okay? So the thing is not as dramatic as this sounds. In particular, and we will see it next week, but let me just point out, think of that setup, right? In that setup, in the pure setup with only two generations, young and old, people are forced at autarky. If they have to rely only on market, they're forced to live in autarky. If the endowment position is particularly extreme, that's very bad. Because you have a lot in one period and nothing in the other. All right? That's good. If one were thinking of markets as a very special arrangement that does not have and this is quite connected to the theory of money, as you will see, that does not have any political aspect, that is not a creation of political and collective decision, but that some self-organized thing that comes around just because you and me bump into each other, okay? That would be a good way of talking about markets, but that's just a silly philosophical way of thinking about market, which is not a proper economic way. Markets are obviously not the product of you and me bumping into each other in the forest or on the field. If you and me bump into each other in the forest or on the fields, most likely you try to beat me up or I try to beat you up. The chances that we end up trading have to do with a lot of extra stuff. That we know each other, that there is some defined unit of trade, that there are rules for trade, that there is probably some enforcement rule that guarantees that I cannot cheat on you more than a certain amount, you cannot cheat on me more than a certain amount. Because if I really want to think as markets as originating spontaneously without any other contrivance, any other restriction, by the pure bumping of people into each other, it doesn't seem to work with historical evidence. Okay? So the portrait here of market is a bit of a figment. It's a bad figment that people often use, and there are philosophical positions or pseudo-philosophical positions that like to stress it, but they're very misleading. So the kind of contraposition that Samuelson creates is a bit silly. Because what is the Samuelson says? You see, here it's useful to have a state, or something that acts as a state and acts intertemporally. Agreed, in fact. Well, that state could create a market to start with, and his suggestion is what the state has to do is to create a token, a symbol, a something that is a sign that I donated when I was young. And therefore, whoever is around when I'm old is forced by that sign to donate to me. Now, that's actually a good intuition. It's something that people have been working a lot as a general idea, right? If you think it's actually what big family, patriarchal families, close communities, moral rules of respect toward the old, of respect toward good citizens do in small communities where markets are not particularly well organized. You invent system of symbols, the signals that J did what it was expected to do in the cooperative game. And therefore, because it has a signal that it did what it was supposed to do in the cooperative game, it's also supposed to receive what she expects to receive from you in the cooperative game. Money is just one such way. And in fact, it's even doubtful that that's what money has ever accomplished to do, but then we will talk about that next week. Okay? The point of Samuelson is we could if we introduce here something that is socially accepted and is a sign that the young person receives from the old in exchange for the endowment that he transfers to the old, then the young person, when old, will have that token in their hand and go over to the new young and say, here is the token, I'll pass it to you. It's like passing the torch, right? And give me what's mine, all right? So once you have a token like that, and you call it money, instead of having a budget constraint that simply says that and nothing else, because you have nothing in the second period, so in the second period you only have this, right? That's the budget constraint in autarky, right? You start having a market and you have what?